Welcome everyone to the inaugural CBRN WADEM webinar. It's a great honour and privilege to be able to deliver this. Certainly I was quite taken aback by the invitation, but very pleased to be able to accept it and feel like I can provide a perspective which is perhaps a little bit unique compared to many of the WADEM members and also the wider medical community, but that may be of quite a lot of interest to all. So my background, I'm Associate Professor David Heslop, and I'm a clinical academic, and I work at the University of New South Wales, which is located in Sydney. I work in the School of Public Health and Community Medicine, and most of my work involves teaching and research surrounding disaster management, but also clinical governance and risk management of high-risk systems. And this comes off a career that has seen me work as a general practitioner, what in the North America you would call a family physician, coupled with an occupational and environmental physician background, and I've worked for many years with the military as a uniformed medical officer, both deployed in the garrison environment here in Australia, but probably for the majority of my career, I've been the lead clinician in CBRNE medicine for the Australian Defence Force in their frontline or tactical response unit, which is located here in Sydney. And so that's given me the privilege of being both exposed to a wide range of experts in this particular field, some of which may actually have dialed into this particular webinar, and so if you're there, hello, and to others who have formed my understanding and supported the Australian Defence Force's capability in this particular area. And so without further ado, I'll move on to the talk, and the topic of today's talk is the pre-hospital major incident environment in the context of CBRNE emergencies. I would like to touch on some of the recent advances that have influenced how we in Australia and also as we see it internationally have really changed our view on how response can be conducted, and this, but also some of the persistent gaps that relate to both treatment, medical operations, and decontamination operations. And so I'll firstly caveat the entire talk is at the unclassified level, and I have deliberately kept it out of a military-only context for a whole variety of very valid reasons. Nevertheless, the concepts are common, and I hope that those of you who have got a military background will understand why I can't go into certain areas, but also those of you who don't will see that really, I assure you that there is going to be no loss in understanding or also importance of the kind of concepts that I'd like to touch on as they apply equally to both the military or securitized context and civilian. So today I'll just touch on a brief introduction, and I'd like to touch on some of the key concepts related to pre-hospital CBRNE environments as I and my colleagues see it. Some of the pre-hospital CBRNE medical approaches and aspects surrounding those environments, and then touch sequentially on some of the assumptions and gaps that seem to have emerged as we have developed capability that we have seen both in civilian, Australian civilian, international civilian, but also military contexts that are able to be discussed in this forum in terms of how they touch on medical operations, and then most sort of, I guess, pithily decontamination operations, which are a real challenge and of course quite unique to hazardous materials or CBRNE environments. And then we'll conclude with some important messages. So let's talk about CBRNE medicine. A lot of people feel that it's simply toxicology in the field, that there is a patient that has a particular, or a casualty that has a particular exposure, and that just needs to be dealt with a few extras sort of added on the side. And that, from experience and from certainly from the published literature, is simply not the case. CBRNE medicine has unique features and considerations which we'll touch on today in this particular talk. The issue that relates to CBRNE medicine is partly that it is siloed within various specialist organisations, and that creates a difficulty when trying to improve CBRNE response systems, in that the expertise is not only few and far between, but also quite difficult to access for a variety of reasons. So the traditional focus of CBRNE defence or CBRNE medicine has been to reduce those human impacts, has been to have good detection capabilities that ranges from surveillance through to various technologies to try to identify where hazard exists and what type of hazard that is, through to systems for warning and also how to avoid exposure, in addition to technological solutions and additional treatment options for treatment, generally speaking in the countermeasures realm, such as, and what we're talking about there is antidotes and some other interventions, and then a focus on PPE and protection. And this creates a bias within the CBRNE response systems from a medical perspective that is focused towards sort of a treatment rather than a systems level development. And this leads to some gaps that have traditionally not been met. And so part of today's talk is going to touch on some of the key medical systems gaps that remain in delivering CBRNE systems in a pre-hospital context. And the reason why I feel that this is important is because there is a gradually increasing likelihood that's both from a threat perspective but also from a technological perspective in terms of dissemination into a variety of people who in the world who would be able to then deliver capability to in terms of dissemination of particular CBRNE threat agents. There's an increasing likelihood of population exposures to CBRNE agents, and this has been publicised and published both internally but also particularly externally now, and is freely available information that there is a concern that CBRNE agents are becoming more of a threat to the wider population. So what was previously a military or securitized only issue mainly for particular very specialist units that needed to deal with particular problems, and the remainder of the population really didn't have a risk of being so exposed, that seems to be changing. Coupled with that is an all hazards approach that is really rooted in a public health perspective on how to deal with population problems, which is entirely valid, but the issues do arise from that particular approach in terms of generating the subject matter expertise in a concentrated enough way, along with the equipment and capability to be able to deliver a sensible response. Unfortunately, all hazards response systems, in their attempt to be all hazards response systems, can sometimes not deliver anything in a particularly effective way apart from the basics, which is okay, but that has to be recognised. So I'd like to quickly, just very quickly, and I apologise for some of you who will know this incredibly backwards, but others who may not, just touch on the broad range of what we would say is the agents that we would be concerned about when talking about pre-hospital CBRNE systems. And so I will skip over these slides very quickly, and I'm not going into great detail, and it's to provide an overview. But traditionally we've looked at CBRNE hazards or threat agents or particular substances in various groups, such as the nerve agents, pulmonary demogens, cyanides and vesicant agents forming part of the chemical threat group, and there's some examples of population and military exposures and events that have occurred over history to the right. And then there are the toxic industrial materials and chemical exposures, which have a significant overlap, and really the only distinction being between CBRNE exposure and or context, and a hazmat context being questions of intent and questions of deliberacy, or whether an exposure is at particular levels of concentrations in a particular context. So much of what the chemical side of CBRNE medicine is almost, or is indistinguishable from hazardous materials management. But then we touch on the incapacitating agents and right control agents being another group, which are starting to emerge as more of an issue. And so I just need to mention them here. They are of concern, and as Paracelsus did highlight, the dose maketh the poison. So agents which are therapeutic, such as pharmaceuticals at certain doses, can of course be lethal at higher doses, and it really comes down to the intent and the delivery of those particular substances. And we're facing a world now where the access to particularly opiates in the community is rising, and of course the hazards associated with individuals accessing those particular chemicals and potentially using them seems to be rising, or certainly the opinion is that it is rising. We touch on the biological threats, and there are some of the major threat agents that are of concern outlined here, and these form what you would read in the literature, certainly in the basic CBRNE medical literature, as primary concerns. And the radiological agents conveniently grouped here into conceptually where agent or isotope groups that you would commonly see in certain contexts, and each of these have particular medical response algorithms and particular medical response approaches over and above standard care. And then finally, E, in terms of CBRNE, is grouped in as an explosive threat, is grouped in, and it really has been added into that acronym, has been because a lot of the agents will be disseminated using some kind of explosive mechanism or delivery device, but also so there is a lot of overlap in terms of the injury patterns that you might see from a explosive device which has a component to it which has a CBR agent contained within it that you would have to deal with, and so it is convenient to consider them together. However, some of the treatment approaches to E events or explosive events are quite unique to that particular exposure, and so we are included here for completeness, but the focus of the remainder of the talk will be primarily on C, B and R in terms of managing hazardous materials in the pre-hospital environment. So we come away from this complex environment where you may be exposed to a wide variety of particular agents, and we have to devise a system that is actually able to deal with hopefully as many as possible. And we look back to how the CBRNE medical treatment or response system in the pre-hospital environment has been promoted and developed over many years in the past. And it's usually discussed at an individual casualty level, particularly for clinicians, and this is of course no surprise. Clinicians are interested and have primary responsibility for an individual casualty, so we need to understand toxidromes, we need to understand of course toxicology, we need to understand treatments and antidotes, and we need to understand how to stabilise casualties well, and there's been much work that's been done on this. However, understanding individual casualty management at an individual level is only part of the story about understanding how to deliver pre-hospital CBRNE medical response which is effective as a system. And so as a senior clinician responsible for delivering a particular medical effect for the Australian Defence Force to deliver CBRNE medical effect, there was much more to the issue than simply having the right treatments on the shelf, the right training for the staff, and the right systems to deal with individual casualties. So some of the things which have been historically poorly considered relate to health system integration, such as resource requirements, personnel requirements, training requirements for team-based or planning-based contexts. So we're talking population training rather than, or training to deal with populations or groups of patients rather than training for clinical scenarios, although both have required attention. Multiple casualty situations, managing the novel or unknown agent, the issue of decontamination, and the different contexts in which that can be applied, and how to build systems which are flexible enough to deal with other contexts. How to understand whether your system is performing well, whether certain test and evaluation systems are required and what they are, and the ethics and legal aspects of delivering these particular systems, where frequently in the modern era we're having to respond as a military organisation in conjunction with a civilian organisation, where ethics and legal dimensions are understood and interpreted in very different ways. So talking about this pre-hospital environment, we can see that there are a wide variety of potential environments that you might find yourself in as a clinician, and each of them has particular unique characteristics, but all of them are austere. And even at the top right, this is Kingsford Smith Airport in Sydney, it's actually a fairly remote environment at some places within that particular location. It's quite complex, it's quite exposed, particularly to environmental conditions, but it can be exposed from a wide variety of other dimensions as well, including exposed from a media perspective and exposed from a population or crowd control perspective. So quite difficult and variable. So one context quite different to another, different considerations, and quite difficult to make sense of it in an all hazards or a unified way. And so frequently a fallback position for from a civilian perspective to develop systems, and this is a very colourful version of an emergency response diagram that could have been drawn from any of the states of Australia and certainly from internationally, where you have a hot zone, a warm zone and a cold zone, and you have people who are involved at the bottom left coming into the hot zone to deliver some kind of effect in that threat environment to casualties who are depicted here, and as you can see, and that are somehow through various processes moved through a decontamination process into some form of sorting mechanism, where those who need treatment are hopefully provided with treatment first, and those who need treatment less are provided with treatment later on. And so this is a very typical worldwide approach, and it's rooted in particularly in the Anglo countries, the the UK, Australia, in policies such as the Major Incident Medical Management and Support System, or MIMS, which enshrines this kind of approach. The issue being that these responses are usually a core of a much larger response that is gradually accreted or built upon as a particular incident unfolds. And it delivers a system which has ultimately hundreds potentially of individuals on site having to interact in a very complex way with at times not a very clear set of not a very clear set of objectives to achieve. There is very much a reliance on the individual components to achieve what they, within their individual services, would see as their primary missions. And at times, coordination, control, and command of these entire sites can be quite challenging. And so That leads to, unfortunately, responses both when exercised but also in real life situations that have perverse outcomes, and where decisions decisions on the day not only do not make sense, but in retrospect make absolutely no sense. And for those of you who are Australian, I think you would understand my reference to the Lint Cafe siege findings from the coroner's court recently and the inquiry, which relate to the performance of a very similar kind of scenario, not involving a CBRN agent, in Sydney a number of years ago. And the issues were the criticisms were primarily related to command control coordination and decision making about how to apply resources in the best possible way in difficult circumstances, granted. So how is this decision making achieved? And as you all know, there's a risk management framework which has been adopted by many jurisdictions, which is trying to achieve a mission in the context of reducing risks to as low as reasonably practicable, whilst minimising harms to other things of consideration, such as the environment and of course the emergency responders, and maximising the outcomes in terms of saving the lives of the casualties, is, generally speaking, for the medical profession, the primary mission that we are trying to achieve. And this has been very effective for many situations, and generally speaking, when we touch back on this systems perspective and versus the individual perspective, a lot of the factors which are risk controls in reducing risk to an acceptable level or the minimum level that's practicable involve focusing on the response characteristics of a small group of people by increasing their physical training, increasing their medical training, giving them the best possible countermeasures, giving them vaccinations to protect them, making sure that you rehearse them and test and evaluate them, ensuring that you've got everything in place in terms of protocols and keeping them up to date, and then during the actual event, making sure that the times and all of the factors that you feel as a medical professional will impact the casualty in a way which will minimise negative outcomes are achieved, and that is by delivering everything pretty much rapidly but very effectively, delivering to definitive care after decontamination, and achieving a state where you can convert the casualty from a exposed and contaminated casualty into a decontaminated casualty that's been stabilised, so that you can hand them into a system which is ready to accept them from a medical point of view. And so, these protective factors have been the focus of most of the CBRNE pre-hospital medical systems development for many years, and there's been much resources poured into developing new countermeasures, poured into developing new diagnostic techniques, poured into developing new ways of detecting agents and making sure that we can actually apply treatment to individuals in the most effective way. And it posed in a different particular construct. This is just a diagrammatic representation of that. You have some kind of hostile threat environment that you're trying to achieve a mission on the right and an acceptable risk. And so there are deliverable measures that you can put in place which are literally risk controls to achieve that. The problem is that less effort has been placed into developing risk controls that address some of the systems issues. In Australia, that's been very much less so, and I have to highlight, in certain jurisdictions this has been already recognised and has been focused on as a research topic, particularly in the UK through the Health Protection Agency and their recent efforts in decontamination and a few other areas, and the information that they've published has been very much useful, but it's not finding its way out into other jurisdictions for a whole variety of reasons that we'll touch on. So with this pre-hospital environment, we have an austere environment where resources are limited and the needs will not match the available resources, and a very remote environment where everything takes longer than you might expect and might be significantly delayed. And these are the kind of factors that I see as important in terms of the outcomes for casualties in a pre-hospital environment. And dealing with most of these factors is actually more about dealing with systems issues rather than dealing with individual treatment issues for a casualty and the decision making and availability of certain resources for them. It's a combination of the two, certainly not a focus only on treatment. And so these are some of the traditional factors that influence casualty survival in a CBRNE environment as I see them, certainly echoed in many of the much of the literature which I've referred to in a final slide to this talk for your reference. Some of the things which haven't been focused on, which are more based at a systems level that I'll now touch on, really relate to the reality of the kind of populations you might be dealing with. And so as a military doctor, I certainly fell into the fallacy of thinking that my population of trained military personnel was somehow superhuman, or that I could distinguish them, very much so in terms of discipline and their resilience, in terms of their ability to react to, or their reaction to exposure to CBRN agents. And the more I worked with individuals in the military, and the more and this is both within Australia and outside of Australia, the more I recognised that actually there are innate reactions, there are innate realities related to genetics, related to fight and flight responses and autonomic nervous system responses in terms of the links to behavioural response that seem to be, that override a lot of these, what we would like to convince ourselves is good training. And certainly if you're dealing with a population of non-military personnel or non-emergency responders, you're dealing with a huge variety of people's experiences, understandings, a lot of comorbid conditions. Some may be, we commonly talk about children and pregnant women and the elderly as being, particularly vulnerable populations. But there are other factors such as culture, social factors. Just think about prisoners and a few other special categories of potential casualties or patients who have been exposed. And you start to see that casualty survival is actually impacted by not only certainly these common these factors which are common to all casualties, I should say, but also that there's a lot of complexity on top of that in terms of these other factors that potentially might emerge. And so if you think back to this environment, imagine a hot zone where you had a mixed group of civilian casualties that you had to somehow shepherd through this particular small system in this particular case, and you'll see that the assumptions that are built into the decon line, for example, may need to be revised. And so we talk about, from an individual perspective, a generic concept of pre-hospital management at a per patient level. And this can be applied to a wide variety of exposures, both CBRNE or hazmat or toxic industrial material. And really it is, if you're exposed, then you give initial treatment, you remove from that exposure, then you get initial medical care, initial decontamination. You're retrieved to a point where you go through a formal decontamination process, and then you're handed over into a wider medical system. And really the medical system, in a wider sense, demands that casualties are not going to end up harming their medical staff or contaminating their facilities. And so prior to that point, effectively, there needs to be an effective system of handling those casualties, and that is the pre-hospital system. And this very linear system, and it is linear and very much simplified, works at a per patient level. However, in the context of the previous number of slides, delivering this particular system for more than one or two or three potential, or a handful of casualties is a real challenge. And so I'd just like to touch on some of the issues related to specific components of that for the remainder of this talk. And so in terms of medical operations, these are the kind of factors that you really need to consider, and it's incredibly complex. You need to put in risk controls, you need to build resilience. I've touched on some of these. These are all risk control strategies. In terms of the typical approaches that we see in emergency response organisations, you'll see that there's some kind of personal capability that's provided, and then there's some kind of accompanying medical support that's that's provided, and that all works very well when there's resources that are matched to what would best be described as a threat that's emerging. So that is an organisation that's ready to respond to a particular event and has got all of those things in place. The problem is, of course, that if you're an emergency response organisation rather than a military organisation, much like what I was involved in, that's specifically designed and ready and waiting to respond to a CBRNE event, you have other business to attend to. And so how do you prepare yourself adequately to respond to potentially quite a rare event that's occurring out in the community or out in a particular context where that requires a significant amount of resources, such as canisters and respirator supplies, thinking about issues about personnel issues, how to train those personnel, and then how to deliver enough resources in a CBRNE specific environment to deliver an effect that's going to be credible and also that's going to work. And these are things that haven't actually been adequately resolved. Even for a bespoke military organisation, for example, or emergency response organisation that's dedicated to providing CBRNE response to a particular area, catering for a very select group of exposures, it is a challenge. And so this is one of those gaps that I see as one of the key research areas that needs to be focused on. How do non-tailored and potentially generic response systems respond most effectively to CBRNE events? And so if we take that particular flowchart, linear flowchart with the clinical tasks or events on the left, where we step through a particular step-by-step individual casualty approach, then what I've tried to indicate in this table here is that for a response system that's prepared and tailored, which is the first column as we step to the right, self-aid and buddy aid, removal from further exposure, initial care and decontamination, these are all things which are either drilled and very rapid and almost intuitive to being sort of, what we would expect and working to a particular level of capability. But if we go further to the right, where the response system might be an unprepared system, that is a generic response system that it just assumes that a CBRNE event will be able to be managed using standard protocols, we find that there's quite a lack of ability to deal with certain key aspects of that treatment pathway. For example, self-aid and buddy aid, even for emergency responders, being fairly minimal, and some of the issues required to understand that in terms of training may be absent. And so my concern about the state of the pre-hospital system outside of very prepared and tailored systems is that it has a great difficulty in being able to respond to what they profess under these systems to be able to respond to, and that's a concern. Some of the work that's been done here in Australia to address some of the key issues and contexts, for example, the NCCTRC, which is the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre, has done some recent research looking at the impacts of individual emergency responders in hot conditions. And so most of Australia is extremely hot. And as a military senior medical officer, one of my primary concerns was how to respond into the hot north. And so what was found in their research is something which is food for thought as a medical commander, that temperate water immersion is much more effective at lowering core temperature than shade, crushed ice ingestion, or use of misting fans. Now the issue being that and they recommend that a rehabilitation centre with medical support is provided into firefighting conditions and the issue being the kind of turnout that they have to wear in these environments. If they're wearing that turnout in hot environments, then they should have a rehab centre, and I've got a diagram here to the bottom right that shows a water immersion followed by an area where they have evaporative cooling, and it's self-contained with appropriate levels of support. A very interesting and I think quite a good suggestion, and certainly something I've considered. But how would you actually deliver this into a emergency response context in a particular location in an effective way? And some of the issues are practicality, cost, mission impacts, resource requirements, personnel requirements, support requirements, and the unintended systems effects of that in terms of being able to support other activities. How do you staff that? Do you have to cannibalise other staff that are involved in other areas? And these are factors that are not often considered when developing policy and recommendations. On top, the policy refers to what would be good in an ideal sense, but when balancing up against other factors can be quite challenging. And so for reference, and you'll certainly, I won't read through all of these, but I'll just pick on a couple of them. These are some of the current assumptions as I see them relating to medical systems in pre-hospital care. And these are based on conversations over many years with individuals who've had similar responsibilities to myself. And I write them here as assumptions that could then be translated very easily to questions or research questions or gaps. And I'd very much encourage the audience to consider if these will be areas of interest that they might want to look into. And so there are lots of assumptions, such as the variations in standards of care from usual business or usual emergency response during a CBRNE mass casualty incident would be minimal. And that is, I think, a big assumption. But many jurisdictions do work under the assumption that that would be so. Or that variation in CBRNE expertise in clinicians is insignificant and can be addressed with just-in-time training. And that is certainly something which I think is a big assumption, and I don't think is necessarily holds for many locations and certainly many response systems. And some response systems have no CBRNE medical expertise whatsoever. And the assumption that a standard approach to a medical casualty in an emergency context would be sufficient to understand all the different nuances, including contamination and decontamination, and the management of casualties during that process, is a huge assumption. Equally, from a strategic level, centralised decision-making on major incident operational and medical policies applicable in those contexts would be effective, and that the communication would actually be deliverable to the frontline individuals. And what I'm talking about here is, the institution of, for example, the expectant category for during a mass casualty incident involving a chemical agent, any changes that relate to how to handle evidence, or certainly communication regarding in a reverse sense, back up to a centralised decision-making apparatus from the front line, certainly seems to be a challenge that hasn't yet to be overcome. So now I'd like to touch on decontamination operations as a good example of how assumptions perhaps are outnumbering some of the, I guess, evidence that might be required to make good decision making. Decontaminations are of course entirely necessary, and there's a fabulous book about CBRNE operations in mass gathering public events by Casetta that I commend you to, plus a wide range of supporting recent research that's been done through the ORCIDS project, in particular in the UK and Europe, and also other researchers working in the UK particularly and elsewhere in the world. The value of decontamination, it is a medical necessity, it's a humanitarian need, of course. We can't leave people to be exposed. It is a desirable thing to get the contamination off them and try to reduce the impacts. It reduces the spread of contamination, hopefully. It returns personnel to service and equipment to service, which is a good thing because much equipment is very expensive and difficult to replace. And certainly if you have a operational assumption that you're going to bin every piece of equipment that comes off the hot zone and not return it back into the hot zone, that is a very expensive way of doing business. But there are some psychological effects that are positive from decontamination, about reassurance and building resilience and confidence. It's good at scene control because it's a natural control point, and it assists with investigation efforts and saves resources. And so typically what we see in a decontamination pre-hospital decontamination environment, generically we see a contaminated area which has a group of people that come from it, and then they are divided into two. Those who are litter bound and those who are ambulatory generally are the two big categories. They go through a process which is different generally, and then they end up being decontaminated. The issue with the population is that it's assumed that they are generally considered, and I use in quotes, normal, as in but that's normal is actually generally not normal. What I'm saying by that is that there is nil cultural variation. They are obedient and adherent, and they are fit, young, adult, and generally male, and they don't have medical comorbidities, and they follow instructions, and once the process gets started, it's not interrupted. And just saying those assumptions, I think, highlights just how much they are of assumptions, and some of the issues that might arise during the process that might make the process very difficult. So let's talk about the reality of population. So the civilian population norm in Australia, and I'll give you Australian figures, are that there are multiple comorbid conditions that increase with age. So to the right here I have a bar chart which shows that the number of comorbid conditions, or chronic diseases I should say, in various age groups. And you can see as you get up into the even above 45 age group, you have a significant percentage of the population with 3 or more chronic diseases, or 2 or more chronic diseases. And this is from 2014 to 15 data. And so this creates concern. And the concerns are that casualties will be a lot sicker and will deteriorate in unpredictable ways within the decontamination process, which is a natural bottleneck. There's also a high prevalence of mental illness in the population, upwards of 10 to 15 to 20% in some populations in Australia and similar overseas. Quite varied education levels and literacy levels. Of course, there are specific vulnerable groups or special groups, elderly, disabled or handicapped, children, culturally diverse communities. There's also the obese, which respond very differently to various environmental exposures and also toxicologically, and then culturally sensitive situations, which I won't highlight, but I think are obvious to all. And I really want to just touch on the issue of personality and expectations, and I put personality there. Often you don't see it on these kind of things, but slides, but it is important because it's amazing how much that influences people's behaviour and what they feel should happen and how they respond to being put through a particular process that they might not understand. And then in addition, you've got other things such as groups of prisoners, dead bodies, where if they are coming through a decontamination process, issues of personal items, particularly very expensive ones or important ones, and the issues of such as perpetrators or persons of interest, emergency services and key staff. It is hugely complex. And so for the operators, we've also got a lot of different factors that need to be considered when undertaking these operations. And so most of these we've already touched on, but particularly rotation of personnel, the equipment and medical resource resupply and passage of essential medical information through the process are significant areas of gaps that haven't been met as yet. So I'd like to just sort of adjust the previous slide to highlight where I see, and from experience through various exercises, both civilian and military, have noticed some interesting phenomenon. We have an idealised system which moves to the right, but then within that system you actually have events that occur, and it makes perfect sense. You know, sometimes decontamination, and there's been published evidence of this, can take a couple of hours to get through a group of people, and it sounds crazy, but it's true. And so you're going to have deteriorating casualties, and also you're going to have deteriorating people who were not casualties become casualties during that process. And current guidelines and current recommendations for how to run decontamination lines do not really address the issue of how many additional resources are required to handle really more arrows and more possible pathways that people can actually take within these processes. And certainly I'm not advocating for, you know, thousands of people on site, but a lot of the training doesn't really touch on that I've seen about decontamination, and certainly some of the exercises I've seen run don't tend to focus on some of these key issues. You can have, for example, an ambulatory patient who's in the decontamination process who fails that process for whatever reason. There can be a wide variety of reasons. They might deteriorate during the decontamination process and become non-ambulatory and required to go through the full decontamination process themselves, and they have to get from that location to the non-ambulatory start point and then start again, and there has to be people to actually do that. There has to be resources to facilitate that. There has to be somewhere to hold them in this process and some way to deal with that. Otherwise, you end up literally with chaos, and you'll have people who are falling over, unable to be attended to, and staff not knowing which way to turn with competing priorities which will be unable to be resolved. And so these are some of the practical reality gaps that I see with a lot of the approach to pre-hospital CBRNE management, that a lot of the reality of the situation has, while it's been acknowledged, I think that we have an opportunity to improve systems so that they're more flexible and able to manage situations like this. So what are some recent advances that have helped that? So we're seeing with wearable items, with information systems and knowledge management systems, the introduction of automation into decontamination processes and pre-hospital care processes. You know, there are a wide variety of novel technologies that have emerged, such as the ability to evacuate somebody robotically from a hazard environment, which certain militaries around the world have been demonstrating recently. These will become more and more available even outside of the military as time goes on. In addition to that, self-contained decontamination systems where the effluent or the runoff is actually managed appropriately and is held, and it's all contained within one particular setup, for example in a containerized arrangement, certainly are now available and appear to be an interesting solution compared to the many hundreds of individual pieces of items that have to be pulled together in an ad hoc way and then delivered to a site to deliver some decon operations that certainly I've observed. The issue of electronic medical records. So this is now not particularly a novel advance, but something which is now starting to become more disseminated. The ability to actually take data that's collected in the pre-hospital CBRNE contaminated environment and be able to hand that through to the post-decon environment is something that would be very good, however reliant on technology. And so there are some new technologies that will be enabling that in a more effective and reliable way, hopefully in the future. The issue of novel antidotes, and certainly as a clinician, I want to see more and more antidotes that do everything and treat everything perfectly. Certainly that's not the case at the moment, but we're seeing a gradual increase in antidotes that are available and novel antidotes. The issue of active cooling, so trying to have individuals which can operate in for longer in hot conditions, but also monitoring those individuals in the hot zone using physiological monitoring, and systems that enable that are things which are now currently available but will become more widespread. One of the things which isn't really touched on, which is a systems level issue, is the decon evaluation technologies. So recent studies have touched on using fluorescent markers, for example, to test and evaluate decontamination systems, for example, in the UK and the US and in France. And those have been, I think, very much a welcome development that have enabled existing very bespoke and tailored systems to know if their decontamination systems are effective. But there's great capacity for those to be expanded out into looking at how to evaluate in a test and evaluation framework whether people who are trained to do the job on the ground in a civilian context or in a wider military context are actually doing their job effectively. And so there is scope there to introduce those particular approaches into evaluating the performance of systems and the compliance of systems with recommendations and how they actually perform under a variety of contexts. And then lastly, I'll mention modelling and simulation to answer operational questions. Certainly in the UK, there's been, in the US, there's been a lot of work that's happened on developing system dynamics models and discrete event models that allow us to have a look at the logistic requirements and the performance characteristics in a computational sense of decontamination operations, for example, less so pre-hospital sort of frontline incident site models, but there's novel technologies such as hybrid modelling or multi-method modelling, is another word for it, which incorporate agent-based techniques, and those allow the ability to develop models which can be informed by real-world exercises or actual events that will improve our understanding of the performance of systems and help us develop those pre-hospital systems into the future. Persistent gaps are mentioned here, and they're big gaps. So some aspects of medical care remain a gap. There are certain agents we can't do much about. There's a lot of difficulty in managing the decontamination process involving medical devices that remain in situ. For example, intubation tubes, for example, the issue of having to recannulate or get new IV access, potentially for casualties going through a decontamination process if the medical device cannot be reliably decontaminated, depending on the agent, of course. And the issue of any other devices that are applied in the pre-hospital context, and so many response organisations have taken the view that the less you actually apply to the casualty, the easier you'll be, or the better you'll be in that particular context. That's true, but given the context of the variable population that you might be dealing with, that might not be achievable in all in all cases. Additionally, dealing with the wastewater, most exercises, and certainly exercises I've seen that involve large-scale decontamination, do not handle water management properly, and there's runoff that's occurring, and contaminating other areas, including other individuals, if that was a real event. And this is something that has, I think, not been dealt with and remains a significant problem. And as I said before, the handling of in-queue or during decontamination casualty decline or collapses is of particular concern. It certainly has the potential to cause the whole decontamination system or even evacuation system to break down from its intended operation. And I've yet to see this particular issue dealt with in a way which would be flexible enough to deal with a number of different situations. So in conclusion, we've got some time for questions at the end, thankfully. The pre-hospital CBRNE environments are quite unique. They're unique because they're not simply toxicology in the field. They're unique because they have unique systems effects. They involve processes which don't exist elsewhere in the system in terms of managing an acutely unwell casualty from a point of injury site. There's additional steps that need to be involved, and generally speaking will involve more than one person potentially exposed. So a single casualty is not so hard to manage, but anything over 2 or 3 casualties starts to become really quite complex, due to the different pathways the casualties can take during that journey, and the unfortunate reality that systems are not as flexible as we would like them to be. Technical solutions have been the focus based on individual casualty management. As mentioned, that may not be enough on its own to adequately manage multiple casualties. Policies based on assumptions, and it seems to be a bit delinked from the reality of the CBRNE environment and how that might actually play out. And these are the major gaps as I see them. And some organisations have taken great strides in working towards some of these gaps, but I see a great opportunity to come together as a world association in building consensus views, but also drawing together what seems to be quite disparate evidence into a unified approach and set of recommendations potentially for the future. And that's something that I'll put out to the audience here today as something that might be something for the future to consider. New technologies are providing some solutions like computational modelling, but they're not the whole solution. And a return to some traditional methods that have been put aside, such as rigorous test and evaluation, you know, may be the only way to be sure that the systems actually work under significant challenge. And significant challenge is what these particular events are. They are frequently involve very sick casualties in multiple numbers, and a lot of them are really wanting to die due to the nature of the agents. So to actually understand without actually exposing individuals to those agents in an exercise, which you could never do, of course, you need some form of very realistic scenario exercise, and that is quite costly. It used to be done, but it is not so often done anymore due to financial constraints, and a gap is to look at new ways of building evidence to support policy which is valid. And I will leave you with some information. The WADEM CBRNE Special Interest Group is in the process of being raised. We would invite all of the participants to consider joining. It's not a street, it's a stream. It's a specialist CBRNE stream at the WADEM Biennial Conference, and the first time that was run was this year in Toronto, and we intend to run a CBRNE stream at the Brisbane Conference in 2019. The launch will be confirmed in the coming months, but we will be in contact with you as registrants to this talk to inform you of progress on that particular development. And any questions, I'll open the floor to questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Heslop, for that very interesting talk. And also thank you for promoting the CBRNE Special Interest Group as well as the upcoming Congress in 2019 in Brisbane. I'd just like to let everyone know who's still on. We have actually almost the entire group has stayed with us for the talk. So thank you for giving us an hour of your time this afternoon or morning or evening. If you click on the hand icon, it looks like a hand essentially, and what I can do then is unmute your microphone and you can ask a question directly to Professor Heslop. I did get one question sent here through the chat that I'll use to start off the discussion, and this is from Leonard Cole in New Jersey, who happens to also be a member of WADEM's Board of Directors. And Dr. Cole says, sarin can be lethal minutes after exposure. The agent's effectiveness persists for hours. If PPE is not available, should a responder or volunteer not approach the victim area?
Yeah, so this, generally speaking, they should not approach an area of known hazard. And some of the gaps that I have not touched upon in this particular talk relate to the issue of enabling individuals within that particular environment to assist themselves as far as possible. So within the absence of PPE, there is I don't think there's any jurisdiction that could advocate for anyone to go forward into a threat environment and become themselves exposed without adequate exposure. But there are potentially other methods of increasing the resilience of individuals, either at that time, so by providing information about what they need to do, but there's also potentially by increasing their education levels. And I know in the UK there's been some effort to incorporate some emergency response smartphone apps, for example, that provide guidance. And the name escapes me, unfortunately, but they are good systems. They have simple algorithms contained within their phone, on their phone, that actually can be that can be used to provide them with what to do in that situation. The issue really comes also down to litter casualties or collapse casualties. If somebody's collapsed and they're in a threat environment, there's no, certainly there is no way that we could advocate for an unprotected civilian to go into that environment as a matter of course. They would have to be protected. So, of course, the first priority is their own safety. Otherwise, we end up with 2 casualties, of course.
Okay, well, I also see now that Dr. Cole has raised his hand, so I'm going to unmute his microphone to see if he has a follow-up question here.
Please.
Are you there, Leonard?
Yeah, thank you for a very good presentation. I'm thinking in particular of the example of the sarin release in Syria a couple of months ago, and
Yes.
There was a subtext to the horrors that the victims had to be confronted with. Several responders did go into the area and tried to help individuals. It's almost a natural, almost an instinctive response. If you see a couple of people down and you are not yet affected yourself, you want to go in and try to help. I just, by the way, some of those responders who did go in themselves became exposed and did suffer some consequences, though not nearly to the extent or the intensity that the initial exposure caused. So it's a terrible thing to put it this way, but if you stand a good chance of getting in and out quickly with a victim, even if you're not in proper protective gear, I'm just wondering from an ethical standpoint if it's appropriate to say under no circumstance should you go into that area.
Look, I think that is a really valid point, because the reality of the situation is people will try to do that, as you point out, and I'm a realist, and so I agree. The ethics would almost dictate that we provide some kind of guidance, or some kind of guidance on that particular issue. So it's like, we do not advocate for anyone to expose themselves. If you find rather than saying if you choose to, because that almost is tacit approval, we can't as an organisation say do go in and grab a casualty. But if somebody chooses to do that, I think that it would be wise to provide at least some kind of guidance on what would be minimising risks in that particular situation. It is very much a fraught situation in terms of the legalities of it, because frankly, I know certain situations where I would certainly go in and grab somebody, particularly if it was a loved one, that would, people behave in those particular ways, and I think we do need to provide at least some form of response to that. I thank you for the question.
It was a tough one, and I thank you for your response.
Yeah.
Okay, I see a couple other people have their hands raised, so I'll go ahead and unmute the next individual's microphone. Just give me a moment to scroll down. All right, we have a question from Steve Coote. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your microphone, Steve, if you would like to ask a question. Go ahead. Are you there, Steve? He may have stepped away. I think we have one more person who I see had a hand raised. Sven Nilsson. Are you there, Sven?
Oh. Hi, Sven.
Oh, yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Sven. How you going?
Yeah, just given all the issues around funding and that, who do you think should be doing the decontamination? We have so much training we have to do with our emergency staff and that. Should it be specialist services like fire and rescue, or should we be pushing this back onto our clinical staff?
Look, a good question. There's such variability in organisations. So I might use a major hospital, given that, Sven, that's sort of relevant to you, where I know you work, as a good example. So I feel, from my experience, there's a lot of people who could help that don't help. because they're not enlisted to actually be either trained, or they're not enlisted to actually understand that they may be called upon. So there are, I think that there needs to be a quorum of individuals that are able to provide a response or guidance. So effectively the most trained individuals, and then I think other people, potentially quite a few more, need to be aware of what decontamination is, and they might be called upon. I think what you're asking is, is it reasonable to have emergency personnel trained at all? And I think, yes, it is reasonable. I think that there needs to be a real mixed bag of individuals who could participate in the process in a variety of different roles, particularly if we think about deteriorating casualties during the process. You need more than just clinicians there. You need people to actually assist with the movement of individuals. You need people to actually get resources. There needs to be more support. Now, balanced against that, there's a natural aversion to putting more people in harm's way, but balanced against that is that there's going to be complexities that emerge within the process. So I would say that it's more than just simply one facility or one subcomponent of a particular facility's responsibility. In the military, for example, the responsibility goes to the engineers. Well, what happens if your engineers are tasked elsewhere? You do need the ability to have other people to form this essential component. What happens when you need to rotate your engineers out? What happens when you need to rotate your emergency personnel out? If you've only got a few people trained up to a certain level, then you can't actually do that effectively. So I see it as one solution is to have almost an expert group that has both practical and theoretical knowledge about decontamination, which provides that depth, and then you have quite a lot of people who can work as operators within that environment, and that would then provide that sustainability. It's probably not the answer that you might have expected, and it may not relieve the staff. I'm talking about more training rather than less training, but perhaps a different type of training than what's normally done now, where everyone goes through the whole process of learning about it from way to go.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, at this point, I don't see any other participants who have their hand raised, so I think we can go ahead and conclude the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for participating and staying on. I know we went a bit over the 60 minutes we had initially planned for, and I'd really like to thank Professor Heslop for taking the time to do this webinar for WADEM. Professor Heslop, did you have any final comments you wanted to make?
All I'll say is I've just put up the reference list there. I'm more than happy to share the slides to either the whole group or to those who ask for it. So I might provide that to you, Andrew, if that's okay.
Sure. That actually leads into the next comment I was going to make. We will post this video to WADEM's YouTube channel and also put it on the WADEM website on the webinar series page. And then if you send me the slides, I can have a link to them where people can access those as well.
Fabulous. I'll do that.
Well, great. Thanks, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good night, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. And we will be finalizing the remainder of the webinar series for 2017 in the coming weeks. We have October confirmed and August tentatively confirmed. So we'll be having several more webinars before the end of the year, and we'll let you know as those are confirmed, and we'll send out an email. Thanks much, everybody.
Thanks, Andrew. See you.
Have a good one.